everyone. My name is Taya. I'm one of our team captains this year, and last year I was the competition president. And this is Sarah, who is our lead competition mentor. And this is the Road to Regionals, an FRC instruction manual on how 971 executes our competition philosophy. So how did we get here? How did we find our philosophy for this season? Now, it starts off, some prerequisites is that we are a NASA house team, which means that we have the ability to go to the NASA Ames field to use the Space Cookies resources for drive practice. And to do so, we must transport our robot all the way from our lab to NASA, which while it is a short journey, it led us to a variety of complications that we could have never predicted. Now, we always like to joke around on this team that we say that NASA is cursed, because for the first 3 drive practices of our 2022 off-season, the robot failed to work every single time we came to NASA. I'm not kidding, we were there for about 10 hours for the total of those 3 drive practices, and we got about an hour of driver training for the entirety of the time. This is because we had absolutely zero method of quality control during this process. We made the assumption that the robot should work, so bringing it to NASA means that it would work. And we left a lot of unnecessary doubts in ourselves when we were taking it over. Now, after these 3 drive practices and a lot of trial and error, frustration, and last-minute fixes on the field, it led us to read a book called the Checklist Manifesto. It's a really good book. I highly recommend reading it. And it gave us our competition philosophy for the season, which is that a checklist is what is going to fix as many of your problems as you can think of. And then Sarah will give a little bit of the mentor perspective on this topic as well.
So Taya asked me to jump in on this slide and just provide a bit of a mentoring side of the story. It was incredibly frustrating because we'd get to drive practice, you'd put the robot in the field, and you'd say, okay, let's start drive practice, and the students would go, oh, but XYZ doesn't work. Like, well, okay, why did we come? Like, we can fix that a lot easier in our lab than on the field at NASA. So by putting in place all of these checklists, we got to the point where at least most of the time when we turned up to NASA, it would still work. Obviously, we still had some trouble, and the NASA curse we still believe lives on, but it's gotten a lot better.
Now, we know that a lot of our work in 971 goes through before the competition. So before we are stepping onto the field in practice day, we put a lot of work into it, because we know that all of that planning and hard work will only be successful at competition if we do it beforehand. Starting off, team roles. This is something we pride ourselves in at 971. We make sure that every single person attending competition has a role. Whether that is data scouting, pit crew, drive team, everyone has something that they should be doing and an assigned task that they can work on for the duration of the competition. Now, taking this out, every sub-team, for example, the pit, scouting, our ACE team, and drive team will have a leader. So they'll have someone who we can act as a point of contact for that entirety of the time. We had a lead student on our scouting team. We have a lead pit crew student, just to make sure that if anything goes wrong in each of those sub-teams, we have an exact point of contact that knows what's going on in that sub-team and can give us the information we need. And because of this, we make sure that we spread out all of our leaders. So we make sure that not all of our strongest students are in the pit, to make sure that all of the sub-teams at a competition have the most efficiency and have leaders on them so that we can take control of all of them and make sure that everything is running smoothly. This is a great example with our scouting team. We had an extremely strong technical student who was working on our scouting team because we knew she had the capability to motivate other students well and would be perfect for that role. That's why we spread them all out, and we think it's a great philosophy, and it worked very well for us. Finally, speaking more of our scouting team, we had to accommodate to a lot of changes coming from our 2022 season. We had issues with motivation, data accuracy, and missed matches that caused a lot of problems for our scouting data. So to do so, we took a couple of steps to try and bring that together before we came to the competition field. That started with team bonding. We had a pancake breakfast for all of our scouts so they could familiarize themselves with both the scouting app. We could debug the scouting app, which was extremely helpful for us to find any other catches, and that people would get training watching actual live matches so they could get familiar with the pace of how the competition would run before they even stepped in the building. We also took a lot of steps to accommodate for a really large team. This year, we had over 100 members on our team, and we took 99 people to champs this past year, which is a massive number, and it means we needed to accommodate for a large amount of people, most of which were on the scouting team. To do so, we took a lot of strategies that they used when making autonomous cars, which included doubling up people on scouting. Now, that doesn't mean that both people are scouting one robot. It means that there is one phone and 2 people watching the same robot. This allowed us to keep other people in check, as one student who is not actively scouting would be able to help the other student check anything that are missed and avoid massive distractions. And we know that if someone had to go to the bathroom, had to leave the competition early, there would always be a backup. This led to a lot of fewer missed matches, and it prevented our data from being inaccurate.
So last season, our data was off by about 25%, which is just so big that it's not meaningful. This season, we went down to about a 5% error. So we were very, very happy with that. Yeah?
What do you mean by off by 25%?
So after the competition, we go back and we take all of our scouting data and we compare it to the Blue Alliance, because that's what we know is the ground truth. And so we're able to say, oh, we thought 25% either more or less points were scored in this match. So we're plus or minus 25%, which is just, it's not useful at that point, right? It might as well be random noise. This year it was a plus or minus 5% margin, which is, one game piece.
And we actually took a lot of this accuracy and started running it throughout the competition to make sure that we were consistently getting accurate data and that we could trust in it when we were making other pick lists and working on strategy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, inspection. This was one of the most difficult steps for us during the season, but we actually learned a lot from it. So a little bit of context. We went into SFR the day before the competition, and we had a couple issues with our cameras on the robot, so we went through and decided, hey, we're fine. Our robot should be fine, and we'll go through inspection when we get there. It'll all be good to go, and we'll be ready for practice matches. We found out that a part of our wiring was actually not up to standards, and it ended up leading one of our mentors to go out, buy house fuses, and have us rewire parts of our robot before getting inspected again. This was a huge problem for us at SFR, and while we did get past it, we wanted to make sure that we would prevent it every single time. This led us to a philosophy that we say, don't let the 1% ruin the other 99%. Which means if you are 99% sure that something is going to be fine, you'll be A-okay, you need to get rid of that 1%. You're going to run the pre-inspection, you're going to get everything checked and ready to go to make sure that you are 100% sure that something is going to work. Now, we've installed a process called pre-inspection. A lot of our mentors on the team are actually volunteers at events who have experience inspecting other robots, so we make sure that those mentors are inspecting our robot as thoroughly as humanly possible. We weigh it multiple times. We check every single element to make sure that we are going to get through inspection as quickly as possible so we can get more time on practice day and run into way fewer issues. This also involved training our pit crew. We found that this was a huge point of advantage because during the season, we have these things called boat bumpers. Essentially, part of our bumpers are raised up a little bit higher on either side since we have a tank drive. So if we're getting hit from the side, the bumpers are lower, which means we're less likely to have another robot go underneath us. But on the other sides where we're driving forward and backward, the bumpers are higher up, which means we can more easily get on the charge station. While this was a completely legal thing, we wanted to make sure that we were ready to go in case someone asked any questions about it. So we actually ended up training our pit crew on what to say to inspectors to explain how these boat bumpers worked and how that they were legal according to the rule book. This helped us out massively during other events to make sure that we were adequately prepared for all of these questions and that we could get through inspection as quickly as possible. So that is one of the biggest bottlenecks of practice day, which I'll talk about later. Finally, the pit. This is one of the massive changes we made for the next season. So in the 2022 season, we had a slightly disorganized pit. There were lots of totes. We didn't have much organization going on, and our packing system wasn't super accurate, and it was really outdated. So we made a ton of changes this year to make sure that our pit was both functional and organized. So this started off with using my potential favorite thing on the team, which is a Milwaukee pack-out. If you ask anyone on the team, they say that I'm the pack-out master. We bought a lot of these pack-outs because we found that they worked best for both for drive practice and for competitions, which means that we can take all of these pack-outs that you see, put them on a dolly, load them in a car, and take them to NASA or another team's field if we want to, which means that we have our resources ready to go. This also allows our pit crew to be more able to test out what combinations of shelves work, see where tools are, and get more familiarized with it when they're going into a competition. We also labeled every single drawer on these pack-outs. If you see in the pictures, we labeled every single thing with not words, but pictures. We found that this is more effective for our pit crew members to make sure that they're not shuffling through reading drawers when they could just see a picture of a zip tie, open it up, and grab it. This actually allowed other mentors, when we're practicing at other teams' fields, to more easily find exact bolts that they need from our storage systems without having any questions at all. This means that it's really easy for both ourselves or other people to work on these pack-outs. We also did something really interesting this year, which is that we mocked up our pit before we go to a competition. Instead of having road cases that you just unfold, we took every single element that you would need in a pit and mocked it out right over here, actually. So for SFR, we marked out the 10 by 10 space, and for MBR, we marked out the 8 by 8 space. And by doing so, it made sure that our pit crew was comfortable with what the layout was, and they had some say in organization and layout. We made sure that we could see how many people would exactly fit in our pit. Since we had a new system and our pit layout was going to be completely different from the past year, we needed to test out the amount of people that we could fit in the space with a robot to make sure that we weren't accidentally overcrowding it. We actually found a solution to this for Monterey, since the pit is 2 feet smaller on one side, that we realized not all of the amount of people that were in our pit at SFR would be able to fit at Monterey. Had we not mocked up the pit, we likely would not have made this decision, so doing so prevented a large issue that we would have seen in the past. And finally, spares. At 971, we're very proud of how we manufacture our spares. If you see in the other lab room, we actually built an entire other spare arm that we could swap out with just 6 bolts. And by doing so and designing for these spares, we made sure that our process for swapping them out would be as easy as possible, and that they were pre-assembled beforehand instead of having parts of an arm that would be ready to go. We had an entire one that was pre-tested that we could just put on the robot if anything happened. We also did so for our gearbox for our arm upright, which was extremely helpful for us. So again, if anything happened, we could swap out the entire system, see what happened, and we'd be ready to go for the competition. We also deliberately manufacture 4 spares. So that means on our parts list, when we're marking off things, if we think something is going to need a spare, we'll manufacture it the first time around. So instead of going back pre-competition and remanufacturing items, we have those spares ready to go from day one. And if any changes are made to the robot, we make sure that we remanufacture with that margin for spares as well. Finally, we also organize our pit for our spares by organizing them by subsystem. So instead of organizing all of our spare 3D printed parts in one place, say like one pack out or one tote, we organize all of our end effector parts in one place. We find that this is really easy for troubleshooting especially. So if we think that our end effector has any issues with it, we grab the entire end effector spare bin, and we'll be ready to go to fix the entire thing, whatever issue may arise, and everything will be organized there. We found that this is way faster than separating things out by category, and instead doing them by subsystem. And finally, our favorite thing, drive practice. We took advantage from the failures that we had in the 2022 off-season for the 2023 season to make sure that we had as much drive practice time as possible. This started off by planning all of our drills beforehand. I would write them down on a piece of paper, and I would make sure to over-plan for more drills than we had space for. So if we were going to be at NASA for 4 hours, I would plan about 5 hours worth of drills to make sure that whatever would happen, we would not have a space where someone would be thinking of drills or trying to figure out what would be happening next. We would always have a planned amount of time at NASA. And while oftentimes we didn't get through all of the drills, you know that we would have some backup to go to at the next drive practice. And by over-planning, we reduced the amount of dead time at NASA. We also had a pre-NASA checklist. So we took a lot of inspiration from the failures in the 2022 season and made a massive checklist to make sure that every single subsystem on the robot was at its full functionality before leaving for NASA. I had a personal philosophy that we will not leave until the robot moves. Until I saw the arm move with my own eyes, I saw it move back and forth, and we were ready to go, that's when we would pack up and leave for NASA. And oftentimes, while it didn't end up having us be late a few times, it was more worth it than having us fix the robot at our lab when we had resources, people, et cetera, rather than fixing it over at a NASA field with potentially limited resources. And this pit checklist carried over into our pit checklist where we would be running functionals, which means that our team was all familiar with how to run a functional before we got to an event. We knew exactly what to do. People had the system down, and we actually worked out a lot of kinks in figuring out how we would run a functional beforehand so that we would be as fast and efficient and effective as possible before we got to an event. Now, this is when we see all of our hard work and preparation pay off at competitions. Starting off with functionals. We have a philosophy. We will run a functional before every single match. We found this out the hard way at 2022 Chesney when we skipped out on running a functional one time, and our robot ended up breaking during a practice match. So this led our team, at least the group in this vicinity today, to know that we will run a functional no matter what happens, and we will see that robot move before we get put on the field. We make sure that it is as thorough as humanly possible, and it includes testing vision, every single subsystem, and testing as many combinations of picking up cones and cubes as humanly possible. We want to make sure we are carrying the widest range of possibilities possible to make sure we are debugging every single element we will be using on the field. Finally, we always say quality over speed. We want to make sure that our functionals are effective and have a lot of detail into them So even if we're running a little bit late to queue, we'll make sure that we are running that functional and that the robot is working before we get over there, because we cannot risk having a broken robot on the field and not risk any level of uncertainty, just like the 99% ruining the other 1%. Finally, we have our ACE team, which is our group of students that goes around making sure that our alliance partners are running functionals. We find that other teams may have to skip out on a functional if they think they're late, but we want to make sure that everyone's robot is working as best as possible, and we want to make sure that people are debugging before they get on the field. So we're making sure that every single person runs a functional before they go to a match, make sure that everyone's robot is at the same standard, and we know if they work or not. Finally, practice day. We use this day to our advantage as much as possible, since we say it is a practice run for the entire competition. We are holding ourselves to the same standard that we are competing at an event where all the matches points count, and we're getting real ranking points whenever we go to practice day. So again, our favorite thing, we make a pre-practice day checklist. This includes asking refs about rule changes. So we found a lot of questions. We had a little bit of uncertainty about rule changes at SFR. So we made sure to ask refs on practice day so we could get that clarity and test out any new elements that the refs might have introduced to us during those practice matches. The practice day also included getting inspected quickly, working through any other strategy elements that may have been left uncertain, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, with practice matches, we play these practice matches with one singular focus. This makes sure that our drive team is focusing on one thing and we're not overwhelming them immediately with the stress of running a full match. So say we wanted to see if our auto worked on the red side for one match. We'll go on the red side, we'll make sure that we're getting our auto down, and for the rest of the match, drive team will just do their thing and take it relatively easy. By doing so, it makes sure that we are focusing on one thing and honing in on one detail that we want to change before we get to the next match. So at SFR, this meant testing out multiple auto positions on different sides of the field and focusing on our drive team in later practice matches during the day. It could also include picking up fallen cones if we want to practice more of that beforehand. But instead of trying to go out and play one match to its full capability and maxing out every single element we can, we take that one focus and work on it as much as possible to make sure that it's honed in and ready to go before competition day comes. We also do our driver debriefs. We make sure that our drivers are both familiar with the process of getting debriefed if they haven't been to a competition before or if it is their first time on drive team. This also allows us to practice multiple elements and see how the process works, and allows our drivers to give feedback about the process to make sure that it is at its maximum capability and that we are adapting it during the competition. We also have field calibration. For doing so, we have our box of pies, which is essentially a mini robot, what we call it, with our IMU and all of our cameras placed on it. This essentially allows us to be in two places at once during a competition. So if our robot is getting inspected, our software captain, Milland, can take the box of pies out, walk it around the field, and calibrate it to its full ability. This actually allowed us to figure out that an April tag at our Monterey Bay Regional was off by a centimeter by walking around with a box of pies, so we could adjust it and help not only our team's vision, but every other team's vision as well. And finally, we have role adaptability. With scouting, we made sure that every single one of our students, regardless of their role, was scout trained. And for this exact reason, we had people who were on ACE team, drive team, etc. They were scouting for the first day of practice matches. Since we usually bring a smaller crew on practice day, we want to make sure that people are able to adapt to different roles as needed. Since, for example, we needed more notes on SFR day 1 on Friday. So by doing so, we had other students note scouting during the day, and they were trained and ready to go and were familiar about the process, so we weren't training them on how to scout the day of, and they had that experience beforehand. So by training a wide array of people, even if you think it's not going to come in handy, it really will. And finally, we have between competitions. Between these competitions, we do a couple things. We want to make sure that we're adapting and doing our things as best as possible. So by switching around a couple elements, it helped us out for the better. First off, roles. All of our roles are completely adaptable. So for example, if you are one role at the first regional we attend, you might not be that one role at champs. It's not set in stone for the entire season. We release them by competition. This is because we want to make sure that we're adaptable as possible. So, as I said earlier, in Monterey, the pit is 2 feet smaller on one side. And by mocking up the pit beforehand, we were able to see that one extra person wasn't going to fit in the pit with a robot, and it would allow a lot of overcrowding. So we actually moved that one student out to another system of the team, which he was then familiar in because he was trained in it, and it worked a lot smoother, and we were able to adapt. We also retrained people. we wanted to make sure that all of our scouts were as trained as possible, so we would retrain our note scouts before champs. I would explain how to do pit scouting, how other elements worked, and we would watch other matches as the competition went on, check out other strategy elements that may have been newly introduced, and make sure that everyone is up to date on how the competitions will be running. We also implemented new roles as the competition went on. This past year, we had a new role at champs, which we called our pick list people. They worked on our pick list for the entirety of the event. It was really helpful for us because instead of having our note scouts, which typically made the pick list, work on it for some of the day and you would lose 2 of them, we dedicated out a group of people to make the pick list, and that way our note scouts could focus on what they were doing and the pick list people could focus on what they were doing. So by creating these new roles, it allowed us for a lot more freedom, and by not setting them in stone at the first competition, it allowed us this adaptability and change, so that way we could grow and be as good as possible at the competition with our roles. And spares. We always make sure that we account for all of our spares used. You can see our spare arm wrapped up, ready to go for champs. We always account for that. We are checking that spare arm. We are making sure that all of them are as accurate as possible, and we're managing our iterations. So if we changed an element of our end effector, all of our spares need to adapt to change that element. We added new guards on our end effector, and instead of just putting them on all of the elements, we put them on our spare arm as well. We packed extra spares, and we deliberately manufactured to account for that overlap of something that may break. We also repack everything. So when we go to one competition, we check off that every single element is in its place, but we also do so before every other competition, because you never know what things could have gotten moved around, and to see what would happen if anything got shifted or taken out. We actually did a little bit of some adaptations to our pit layout for our next competitions, and we're checking off where elements go and what the ease of use is in the pit. So by changing these elements, it made it a lot easier for our pit crew, and it also helped us to manage how we repack. So before we leave for a competition, every single element in the pit will be in its place, ready to go. And finally, drive practice. So between competitions, we watched every single match we lost and every single match we won to see what elements worked well for us and what elements we could test out. And we always take the step to strive for even more when we're going to drive practice. If we're getting 5 links at one drive practice, we will always take the step, get the extra game piece, get the cycles a little bit shorter, and we always make sure to push our drivers to their maximum ability so that way they can get as good as possible and we aren't having our drivers plateau at the end of the season. We want to make sure that they are improving throughout the process. We also reflect on our strategy. So we wanted to see the workflow process from creating a strategy sheet, handing it off to the drive coach, and by reflecting on all of the past strategies we did, we could see what worked and what didn't, and it allowed us to adapt a lot more in coming competitions. Any questions? Yeah?
You said earlier that you train the drivers for debriefs. What do you mean by debriefs?
So the question was to train drivers for debriefs, how did we do that? So essentially, we kind of went through the debrief process that we typically did, but we allowed our drivers to kind of have some kind of give and take and allow them to give feedback on others to better enhance the process. And Sarah can give some more examples on that.
Yeah, so our debrief process, because I think you were asking a little bit about what is our debrief process. So every single match that we run, be it practice or real, we record it. And that recording focuses solely on our robot. And then the student who records that will then take it to the drive team, as well as we have a mentor who will then be mentoring the drive team at the event. And so the students on the drive team, as well as the drive coach, and then the mentor that's assigned to doing debriefs, will all review that video footage, and they'll go over it a couple times, and they'll just see where we could improve. Competitions are not just a chance for you to win, but they're also a chance to improve. And so you want to be constantly iterating through the event, because then you can get better and better as you go. So we learn a lot at competitions because it's just a very fast iteration cycle. Yep.
How many times are you guys able to go to NASA to drive a robot?
Last season we were going about twice a week. Well, it ramps up. So we started in I think week 2, and we were only going once a week for 2 or 3 hours. And then once we had a robot, which was about week 6-ish, we started going more and more. We would go most Saturdays and Sundays, and we would be there well, we'd arrive normally around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, sometimes a little earlier, because we have to negotiate with the Space Cookies because they also use the facility. And then we would be there till times in the morning.
Do you guys keep any field elements here, practice locally, or do you always go over to NASA?
So we have a set of field elements. We actually have like one full grid in our shed that we have ready to go. So occasionally if we need to do drive practice and we don't have access to NASA, we'll clear out this room pretty much in the same way it is now, roll out part of the carpet that we have and set it up there. We usually do like basic cycles then, nothing like crazy, but when we have a full field, we like take full advantage of it and using the whole space, since right now this obviously isn't a full field.
We try to use this space more for
Debugging.
getting ready for NASA, I think is a better way of putting it, just because we think there's a huge value in getting those full field cycles and the visibility and practicing that. I mean, Jordan's our driver, he's actually videoing this, so he can say yes, full field good. Yeah. You know what I mean? But here it's really helpful for things like our arm positions. So our arm has about 100 different set points. So we don't want to waste time on a full field by tuning 100 set points. So those all got tuned here. Our vision system got calibrated here because we have a full set of April tags. We in fact sometimes set them outside, like on packouts to mock up a full field. So we try and do as much as we can here that doesn't require the full field and really focus on dry practice at NASA and auto.
You talked earlier about roles at competition. What are like all of the different roles that you have?
So,
Or like broad categories.
all right, I can go through it. So for all the roles that we have at competition, we have our driver, our manipulator, our human player, we have a drive coach, we have our technician. We have in our pit, each student is categorized by subsystem. So occasionally we usually say pit crew, camera mounts, pit crew, drivetrain, and those can double up on people. So we can have people in the pit working on having an assigned subsystem be like the end effector and the camera mounts. So instead of having like one person per subsystem that would overflow the pit, we double it up. We also have someone on electrical in the pit. We have someone for software in the pit. And we have a pit mentor for both electrical and software instead of just having one mentor there.
Mechanical and software.
Sorry, mechanical and software to make sure we're ready to go there. For scouting, we have data scouts, which are the ones inputting the data in our scouting app. We have note scouts who take subjunctive data, so writing down like what happened in match strategy, what the team's auto looks like, how they like scored, what kind of methods they used, how fast they were. We have another method of driver ranking, where essentially you can rank your drivers in a match on one alliance. So if you think the one robot is the best, next robot is the second best, and the third robot is the best, it allowed us to use some linear algebra to create like an actual rank of all the drivers at competition. So we have our note scouts both scout subjunctively and switch off with doing driver ranking. And then we have a student who's a lead note scout and then a lead data scout, and the lead data scout is leading all of scouting. That's our student Laura. And then we have our people working on the pick list, and then we have a strategy team. Sarah could talk a little bit more about some of the changes we've made to that, if you wish.
You should come to Claire's talk later today, because Claire's going to talk about it. It's in, I don't know where, I know it's in the last session.
Second room.
Room 2 in the last session. Claire's going to be talking about that. But you also have ACE.
Yes. We have our ACE team, so that's students who are going around helping other teams in our upcoming alliances to make sure that they're ready to go. We have a lead student there. And we have our match video recorder, who is the one recording the matches. That is their sole job at competition, to make sure that they're working on the debriefs and getting accurate filming of all of our matches. And I can't think of anything else. Oh, and all of our impact presenters, who also take on other roles at competition as well, but we make sure that we set that out ready to go.
How do you choose your alliance mates, assuming that you've gotten into the final 24?
Oh.
Again, come to Claire's talk this afternoon. There's a lot that goes into it, and there's also a lot of planning. Well, as you know, at SFR, we had a situation where we were invited to join the #1 seed alliance, and we declined. So at that point, you got to do a lot of like contingency planning of where, because you know you're not going to get the first pick, and deciding to decline is always something we take really seriously. And so just making sure, we're comfortable with that. We want someone who we know we're going to work well with. We want someone who like both the two teams are going to work well together, as well as that the robots are compatible. You know, they've got, you'll know, we typically only have one autonomous mode, so we need someone who can adapt to that because we only have one thing we can do.
Yeah, we prioritize like a lot of compatibility when we're making our pick lists.
Yeah, and trying to figure out what our max score could be as an alliance.
Yeah.
Of the 100 or so students you bring to competition, how many of those are only doing scouting?
So,
like, almost entirely doing scouting?
So I think at Champs, we brought 100 total people. So that included like parents and volunteers and mentors. So I think that they were about, I would say like 50, 60 students.
Yeah, we had a lot of parents go to Champs.
Yeah. So of those like 50 or 60, I'd say we had about 40 doing scouting. We had maybe like 18 or 20 doing data scouting. And then I think we had 8 note scouting and then a couple others who were going through and watching past matches in case we missed them to recollect that data. And I'm not sure if that adds up to 40, but that's as accurate as a number as I remember. Yeah?
How do you guys find like tasks for people to do during the build season when you have like 100 people in your team?
That is a very good question and a very different talk. We don't know is the short answer. We're trying to figure it out. We're not typically this big, and it's a new challenge that we're trying to work through. Yeah.
How are you going to select your competitions for this year?
Ooh.
Don't know yet.
Last year, we kind of just did it by time period, so like blocking them out and then just basically how far away they are from us. It wasn't feasible for us to drive like all the way down to LA or go to Utah like by choice. So we basically planned it out by like distance and spaced out.
Yeah.
What is an example of a strategy adaptation you guys did last year?
Sorry, can you say it again?
What is an example of a strategy like adaptation you guys had last year?
So we had a lot of different like elements of how we were going about our runs in the first season, in our first event. So typically we would have just our strategy lead going on runs for the first bit of the event. And we found that it was a little bit easier for us if we took another student with us or took another mentor with us, so it wasn't just one person going on those runs. So by reflecting on that, talking to our strategy lead and like coming back on that, we made sure that we were like able to adapt, since we found that oftentimes there would be a lot more people from other teams going on strategy runs rather than our like 1971 person. So we wanted to make sure to balance it out. So by like taking that feedback into account, we could like plan for that when we were doing our strategy sheets to have another person come with our strategy lead.
What's a strategy run?
A strategy run, that's what we call it when the strategy team goes out to the alliance. So they'll go and try and find our 2 alliance partners, and we have these strategy sheets. For an example of it, come to Claire's talk this afternoon, and they'll go through it and kind of figure out and negotiate what our strategy for the next match will be. So we call them runs because they run out to find the other teams. Yeah.
You talked about doing a pre-match checklist and also going out and checking with your alliance mates to see if their robot is ready to run. How far in advance are you checking on your scheduled alliance mates and qualification matches?
So for our ACE team, we usually got about like 2 of our matches ahead of time. So we would, on Friday, on practice day, we would usually check our alliance members about an hour before the event closed for the first 1 or 2 matches of the day.
If we had the schedule.
Given we had the schedule. So that was part of the issue with the first time. So we would always check at least 2 matches in advance of us, and then we would do a little bit of a check like right before it was time to queue, so like 2 or 3 matches before our alliance members would go up. That's when we would kind of like check on them, make sure that they were running functionals, see if there was anything we could help with, besides that first like big check to see if there were any like larger issues that we could help with to make sure that we had like adequate time to do so. So we usually said like 2 of our matches was how far ahead our ACE team was. And then for strategy runs, we usually were also about 2 matches ahead. We would make sure that we weren't like getting too far ahead, because then that would tend to like confuse other teams and it would get really chaotic. But 1 or 2 matches ahead of ours. So if we played like match 1 and match 4, we would make sure that our strategy for match 1 and match 4 were ready, or at least planned out, or our run for match 1 was done before we would get to the event, and our strategy for match 4 was done before we played match 1.
And that's one of the differences with champs is we can plan out a little bit more because you get the schedule ahead of time generally, whereas at a regional you don't get it till after the pits are closed, usually a practice day.
How many people are like new, and then versus how many people are veteran or like opted on the team?
So for the people we take to competitions, we usually see about like a 2/3 veterans, 1/3 new member split. Oftentimes we have like more than 50% of our new members, or we have a larger number than like 2/3, 1/3 for veterans and new members initially, but a lot of those new members choose not to come to competitions. And by doing so, we usually have more veterans, but there's always still a substantial amount of new members that we see at competitions, so we try to like prepare as much in advance to make sure that they're ready to go. And that varies from off-season to regular season events as well.
And so my question was about like how do you keep like everyone in track, I guess.
So making sure that like everyone knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
So to make sure that everyone knows what they're doing, we make sure we have like a team lead. So we'll have our pit lead to make sure if we ask, hey, what's going on in the pit? Our pit lead knows exactly what to say. We have our scouting lead, so if we ask our scouting lead, hey, what's going on with scouting, they know exactly what to say. So by having like that lead student that just checks on that one like system of the team, so like scouting, pit, ace team, etc., we make sure that everything's like set out a little bit more. And especially with scouting, our scouting lead's very talented, so we make sure that she's like covering a larger group of people. We usually have like some other lead students who can help her out to make sure that everything's running smoothly as well.
Do you select your leads for like scouting like pit crew before competition or like during?
So we select the team roles, I'd say about 2 weeks before competition, and we usually release them a week or two in advance, so that way everyone is like well prepared. And we always like alert the people who we have selected to be leads in advance, like before releasing those roles, so they're familiar with the process. But we always do it before competition, and like we usually take into account how they performed at past competitions, how well they did in their roles there, what their potential for growth is, and we usually take those into account.
And I'd say our leads kind of stay the same throughout the season. So we will like set a strategy lead. Last year was Claire, and Claire was our strategy lead for all of the events. And just to make it a little, like, she's growing her skill set in that area. We want to grow that throughout the season, hopefully leading up to championship. But those roles are subject to change. So it could adapt as needed, but it's kind of, we hope to see that throughout the season, starting even at Chesney. So we consider Chesney like our first event with our new team in the hope that we'll grow those, but it could change based on how everything goes. Nothing is set in stone.
Yeah?
Generally, what is the goal of a drive practice and how does that change throughout the season?
Oh, that's a good question. So starting earlier in the season, our goal is pretty much to just get in muscle memory on our drivers. So for the first couple drive practices, we are pretty much running as many cycles as humanly possible across field.
Let's take a step back.
Before
we have the robot.
Before we have the robot, we actually took a couple of steps this season where we took our third robot drive base from the off season, and we took that to NASA, and we were running full field cycles, pushing game elements around from end to end, basically to gauge how fast we were going. So obviously our third robot drivetrain was not as fast as our past one, but it gave our driver the ability to gain a little bit of muscle memory in advance without a superstructure, to see how that process would go, and like mapping out how we get around the charge station, how we plan out getting on the charge station, and like kind of getting more spatially aware with the new field size. So we did that for about 3 weeks, I'd say, maybe a little bit more as well, to make sure that our driver was really familiar with the field itself without like an arm or any other way to score besides pushing around a cone or a cube. And then once we have the robot, we're focusing a little bit more on our manipulator rather than our driver to make sure that they're getting an ability to get muscle memory on how to do like the different commands. Since our robot this year is really difficult to manipulate, we found that we needed to make a lot of adaptations for the like 100 set points that we needed to do, and our manipulator needed to figure out how to do all of them really quickly. So by running those full field cycles, pretty much focusing more on our manipulator, since our driver had all that practice beforehand, it allowed us to get more muscle memory with him. And then as we moved on throughout the season, we practiced a little bit more on like adaptability. So testing out different elements where like part of the field was blocked off, we would like block off part of it. We would put our third robot like dead around the field to map it out. And we'd focus a little bit more on like change in the time period, since they would have had those cycles pretty much down and ready to go. And later in the season is when we focused a little bit more on like practicing with other teams, that we could see more strategy-wise, like compatibility, and see how that worked.
So, for pit scouting, where you like go around asking teams what sort of information do you want to gather, and like what's the goal, I guess, for that?
It varies by event and what we're trying to do. I think by the time we got to champs, we were mostly just concerned about like weight and size, mostly for balancing.
Yeah. It was usually the things that we considered the most from our pit scouting data were again weight, dimensions, and like where they could pick up stuff most comfortably, just so that way we could make sure that they were as compatible as possible if we were working with them in other alliances.
We're trying to just generally get robot characteristics, because every team will tell you they can score 5 links. Our scouting data is going to tell us if they actually can.
Exactly.
The pit scouting is going to tell us characteristics of the robot, of weight, size, number of motors, programming language, whatever we decide we need to know for whatever reason. You can also come and find us. We'll both be around. But thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And enjoy the rest of the talks.
Thank you.